Welcome, curious minds, to The Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into a story that honestly challenges a really deeply ingrained image. We're talking about Bodhidharma, the legendary figure often linked with Chinese Zen Buddhism, maybe even the Shaolin monks and martial arts. But here's where the story takes a pretty unexpected turn.
It really does. And for this deep dive, we've gathered quite a stack of sources. We're looking at ancient Buddhist chronicles, Chinese temple records, some fascinating archaeological finds, and even, recent scientific analyses.
Okay.
Our mission really is to unpack Bodhidharma's profound Indian origins, trace his, epic journey across Asia,
Right.
and ultimately show how his teachings completely revolutionized spiritual practices in China, creating what we now call Shan, or, Zen Buddhism.
It sounds like a proper historical and spiritual detective story. We'll try and connect the dots for you using all these diverse sources and hopefully uncover those aha moments. How a South Indian prince's amazing journey ended up profoundly shaping East Asian spirituality. So yeah, let's unpack this.
Absolutely. I think most people, when they picture Bodhidharma, they see someone distinctly Chinese, right? Maybe from those old paintings, that intense stare.
Yeah, exactly. The bearded, intense figure.
But our sources, they challenge that stereotype right from the start. He was actually a bearded Indian monk.
Wow.
Yeah, who became the founding father of Chinese Zen Buddhism. He really straddled these worlds, blurring the lines between East and South Asian spiritual traditions.
That really does flip the common image on its head, doesn't it?
Right.
So, okay, digging into these ancient chronicles, what specifics do we have about his birth, his early life, that really cement this Indian connection?
Well, the most consistent accounts, they point to his birth in Kanchipuram. That's in South India. And this was around the 5th century.
Kanchipuram, yeah.
And it wasn't just any birth. The texts say he was born a prince, which makes his later decision, to give up all that royal comfort for the Buddha's path, incredibly significant.
A prince. And not just any royal family, right? The sources identify him as the third son of a Palava king.
That's the detail, yes, the Palava dynasty. And you have to understand, they were major players in South India back then. Politics, art, architecture.
Like the shore temples at Mahabalipuram, weren't they Palava?
Exactly, iconic sites like that. And they supported both Buddhist and Hindu traditions, so it was a complex environment. But can you just imagine the luxury, the power he walked away from? Palace life, servants, influence.
Oh, he literally traded silk robes for a monk's simple cloth. It's amazing. And Chinese records actually mention this.
They do. They refer to him as the third son of a great Indian king. That detail fits perfectly with the Palava royal structure of that time. I mean, the conviction that must have taken.
Unbelievable.
It really speaks volumes about his spiritual drive. And think about the environment he grew up in. 5th century South India was this incredible spiritual melting pot.
Right.
You had Buddhism flourishing right alongside Hinduism, Jainism, various folk traditions. The Kanchipuram itself was a major intellectual hub, kind of like Nalanda further north, but maybe more diverse in some ways.
So you could picture him as a young prince listening to debates.
Absolutely. Debates between Buddhist scholars, maybe visiting from Sri Lanka, Greek philosophers perhaps, Hindu pundits from North India, all happening possibly within his father's court.
So the seeds for what he eventually taught in China were definitely planted back in India. How did that influence his early training?
Well, his initial training was under a Buddhist master named Prajanatara. And this really shows the deep roots of dhyana meditation practice in Indian soil.
Right.
And what's fascinating is that the physical discipline, the stuff that later evolves into Zen practices and maybe even martial arts, it really began with Indian yoga and breathing techniques. Things Bodhidharma would have learned as a young man.
That's a powerful link right there. But okay, let's talk evidence. How solid is this? You mentioned a range of sources. It sounds like more than just legend.
Oh, much more. It's a compelling tapestry, really. You've got consistent references in multiple ancient Buddhist chronicles pointing specifically to Kanchipuram. Then there's a key early Chinese text, the record of the Buddhist monasteries in Luoyang from the 6th century. It calls him a Persian Central Asian, which sounds confusing, but it's from the Western regions.
Which was their term for India back then.
Exactly. It was a common, if geographically vague, term for that area. And we also have accounts from a later Chinese monk, Yi Jing, who actually traveled to India and wrote about meeting Indian monks who spoke of Bodhidharma as, one of their own countrymen.
Wow. And then there are even later, more detailed Chinese sources you mentioned.
Precisely. The further biographies of eminent monks, compiled around 645 CE, explicitly states he was from South India, the Western region, No ambiguity there.
And that anthology.
Right, the Anthology of the Patriarchal Hall. This is a foundational text for Zen lineage from 952 CE. It vividly details his South Indian royal background.
So the Chinese tradition itself confirms it.
Strongly. And beyond China, you find other corroboration. Archaeological findings from the Palava period sometimes mention Buddhist royal family members whose timelines could match his. Plus, Sanskrit texts preserved in Tibet talk about a Bodhidharma from southern India who traveled east.
And Japan.
Even later, Japanese records consistently maintain the Indian origin story. There's no real contradiction across these different cultural records. It's quite a consensus, actually.
So it's clear Bodhidharma wasn't just, randomly wandering. He had a mission. What drove him to make that huge journey to China?
It seems to stem from a really profound spiritual calling. Tradition holds him as the 28th patriarch in the lineage tracing back to the Buddha himself.
28th, wow.
And he apparently felt a responsibility to spread the authentic dhyana practices. There's a sense in some accounts that these practices were becoming a bit diluted, maybe even in India.
And his teacher, Prajnatara, played a role.
Yes, the story goes that Prajnatara specifically instructed him, "After my death, go to China. The land is ripe for the true Dharma." So it was framed as this sacred mission, to relight the direct flame of enlightenment where it was needed.
And he arrives in China to find Buddhism looking, well, not quite like what he practiced back home.
Exactly. It had become a complex mix, lots of rituals, intense intellectual debates, significant imperial patronage, but often missing that core point of direct enlightenment through meditation.
You have to remember the context, too, right? Buddhism wasn't new to China when he arrived.
Not at all. It had been trickling in for nearly 400 years before Bodhidharma showed up, mainly via the Silk Road, that amazing highway for goods, but also for ideas.
Right.
By the 5th century, Chinese emperors had welcomed scholars, they'd built grand monasteries, but the essence of the teaching had arguably been diluted. It got sort of twisted to fit existing Taoist and Confucian ideas.
And the monasteries became powerful institutions.
Yeah, they became political centers, sometimes quite far removed from the Buddha's original focus on individual awakening.
Okay, so this legendary voyage, the timing is a bit uncertain, as you'd expect for something this ancient. Sometime between 470 and 520 CE seems to be the window.
That's the general consensus, yes. He likely left from a South Indian port, maybe Kanchipuram itself. Some accounts suggest he spent a long time at sea, maybe 3 years, stopping at different ports along the way.
3 years at sea.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. The earliest reliable Chinese mention we have, that record of the Buddhist monasteries of Luoyang from 547 CE, describes him arriving as this aged monk from the western regions.
And that journey wasn't exactly a pleasure cruise.
Far from it. Maritime travel back then was incredibly dangerous. You're facing monsoons, pirates, shipwrecks. It was unbelievably risky.
And then he gets to China, and the challenges continue.
Oh, absolutely. First off, the language barrier must have been immense. Relying on interpreters for deep philosophical concepts, that's tough.
Yeah.
And his whole approach, emphasizing direct meditation over studying scriptures, that confused a lot of Chinese Buddhists who were very text-focused. Plus, his appearance, being Indian with those distinct features, he was seen as an outsider, sometimes even labeled a barbarian.
Which brings us to that famous, almost infamous encounter with Emperor Wu of Liang. That really highlights the culture clash, doesn't it?
It really does. The emperor lists all his good deeds, building temples, sponsoring monks, and asks Bodhidharma, "What merit have I earned?"
And Bodhidharma just says,
"None whatsoever."
ouch, talk about blunt. Not exactly winning friends and influencing people in the imperial court.
Not the most diplomatic approach, no, but it perfectly illustrates his point. External actions don't automatically equal inner realization.
But it was more than just personality clashes or different meditation styles, right?
Yeah.
You're saying he brought a whole cultural package.
Yes, absolutely. His emphasis on physical discipline, for example, that's often seen as planting the seeds for what eventually became Shaolin Kung Fu.
How does that connection work?
Well, the legend of him spending 9 years facing a wall at the Shaolin Temple, whether literal or symbolic, it inspired new approaches to physical training. The idea was that monks needed physical stamina to endure long hours of meditation. So he introduced exercises, likely based on Indian yoga and maybe even martial practices he knew.
Strengthening the body to support the mind's work.
Precisely. It wasn't about fighting initially, it was about meditative readiness.
And his influence went beyond the physical.
Oh, definitely. His presence even affected language. New Chinese terms had to emerge to describe the specific states of mind cultivated in his form of meditation.
And art, you mentioned the portraits.
Right. Those early Chinese portraits are fascinating. They consistently show him with distinctly non-Chinese features, the wild hair, prominent nose, those intense large eyes.
Oh.
It created a new kind of aesthetic, quite different from traditional Chinese depictions of sages.
And intellectually.
Intellectually, his direct, experience-based approach was a huge challenge to China's very text-heavy scholarly traditions. He introduced this radical idea of a special transmission outside the scriptures.
Meaning enlightenment could be passed directly, mind to mind, not just through reading.
Exactly. That was a core Indian concept, but pretty revolutionary in the Chinese context at the time.
Okay, so let's dig deeper into the heart of his teaching. The Indian Buddhism he brought. What specific dhyana practices did he transmit?
He brought practices honed in India for centuries. Things like anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing, a fundamental technique, and various other forms of, well, just being aware, mindfulness meditation.
And the wall gazing. Big one.
Yes, big one. It sounds strange, maybe, but it was a method for direct, unmediated awareness, cutting through the constant mental chatter by just observing, perhaps using a wall as a focal point to steady the mind, but ultimately going beyond it. He also taught single-pointed concentration, but crucially, without relying on scriptures as the object.
And the two entrances.
Right, his framework of 2 entrances and 4 practices. The entrances were through principle understanding the core truth and through practice engaging in the methods like meditation. It was incredibly stripped down and direct compared to the complex rituals and merit-making activities common in Chinese Buddhism then.
It wasn't about adding more. It was about realizing what's already there.
Precisely. His teachings were deeply rooted in Indian Mahayana concepts. The absolute cornerstone was Buddha nature.
The idea that everyone already is enlightened, essentially.
Yes, that was radical. Many Buddhists at the time were focused on practices to become a Buddha over countless lifetimes. Bodhidharma, drawing on Mahayana, was basically saying, you're already there, you just need to realize it.
Like uncovering something hidden, not building something new.
Exactly, like digging for gold that's already in the ground. You don't create the gold, you just remove the dirt. He also emphasized other key Mahayana ideas like shunyata, emptiness.
Meaning things don't have a fixed, independent existence.
Right. And the bodhisattva ideal working for the enlightenment of all beings and non-duality. He really embodied this practical aspect, too. You hear stories, maybe apocryphal, of him tearing up sutras.
Which sounds shocking.
It does, but it wasn't about disrespecting wisdom. It was pure Indian Mahayana pragmatism. Direct experience trumps theory. Knowing about water doesn't quench your thirst, right? You have to drink it.
He really stood on the shoulders of Indian giants, didn't he? Part of a long lineage.
Absolutely. Tradition places him as the 28th patriarch in a direct line from the historical Buddha. His thinking clearly echoes earlier Indian masters like Nagarjuna, the philosopher of the Middle Way.
And others.
Maybe Ashvagora, known for direct pointing instructions, and certainly masters from schools like the Sarvastivada, who are known for really systematizing dhyana techniques. And of course, his most direct link was his own teacher, Pratyahara, who explicitly told him to go east.
So he really served as this crucial bridge.
A vital conduit, yes. He carried the living essence of Indian Buddhism that focused on direct experience, non-conceptual awareness, meditation-based realization, and planted those seeds in Chinese soil. And they grew into something both familiar and profoundly new, Chan.
And the evidence we talked about earlier is the text, the archaeology. It just keeps reinforcing this Indian connection, doesn't it?
It really does. If you look specifically at South India, you find these intriguing traces. Things like palm leaf manuscripts from Tamil Nadu that mention a prince monk named Bodhidharma who traveled to China.
Wow.
And there are records from Kanchipuram itself that speak of a royal descendant who gave up his duties for enlightenment, matching Bodhidharma's story perfectly. Maybe even inscriptions from the Palava era, 7th century, at Malappuram.
And the Chinese sources are explicit.
Incredibly so. We mentioned the Zhuge Singh Zhuan, calling him a Persian barbarian from South India, and the anthology of the Patriarchal Hall specifically saying a South Indian of the Western region and the 3rd son of a great Indian king.
And that very early Luoyang record.
Yang Xuanzi's record of the Buddhist monasteries of Luoyang, 547 CE, written maybe just decades after Bodhidharma's time, it directly mentions the South Indian monk Bodhidharma. It's hard to argue with that kind of contemporary mention.
Then there's the visual evidence in art, those early depictions.
They're so striking, consistently non-Chinese features. The The prominent nose, the deep-set or intense eyes, often large. Elongated earlobes, which was a mark of nobility in India. Sometimes darker skin, curly or wild hair, a broader nose compared to typical Chinese figures.
And these features echo sculptures from his home region.
Yes, there are definite similarities to South Indian Palava-era sculptures, not just facial structure, but also things like the earlobes, the typical meditative postures, cross-legged, stable, and the minimal monastic robes. It's like a visual fingerprint, preserved across cultures.
And even recent discoveries are adding layers to this.
It's exciting, actually. There was an excavation near Kanchipuram in 2018 that uncovered monastery ruins. And get this. They found inscriptions mentioning monks traveling to Tang lands, Tang China potentially, around Bodhidharma's time.
Incredible. A physical link.
And it gets even more specific. There's been some DNA analysis done on artifacts recovered from meditation caves traditionally associated with Bodhidharma. And guess what? Traces of South Indian origin.
Wow, science backing up the ancient texts.
Exactly. Plus, linguistic studies are showing fascinating parallels between concepts in the original Chan teachings and philosophical terms in Tamil and Sanskrit. And just recently, a translated manuscript turned up from the Dunhuang caves in Tibet, dated around 750 CE. It specifically mentions Bodhidharma from the Palava kingdom, who brought a unique meditation style to China.
That feels like pretty direct confirmation.
It's very powerful evidence, yeah.
So when we talk about the legacy of Indian Buddhism in Chan or Zen, it's not just theoretical. His core methods, like wall gazing.
Straight out of Indian yogic and meditative traditions. Practices like watching the breath, cultivating stable awareness without getting attached to thoughts that's held. These were staples in India. His method was about stripping away the non-essential to get to direct insight.
And the whole philosophy of mind-to-mind transmission.
That comes directly from the Indian guru Shisha tradition. The idea that the deepest wisdom isn't always in books, but is passed directly from teacher to student, often beyond words.
Like his blunt answer to Emperor Wu.
Exactly. That stance, no merit in external acts alone, stemmed from Indian traditions valuing inner transformation over outward displays. The famous Zen phrase, a special transmission outside the scriptures, points directly back to certain Indian Buddhist lineages that emphasize this unmediated insight.
And he managed to blend these Indian ideas with Chinese culture.
Seamlessly over time. He integrated deep Indian concepts like emptiness shunyata, which comes from Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka school, with existing Chinese philosophies. Things like Taoist Wu Wei, non-action or effortless action, and a certain Chinese pragmatism. His two entrances teaching is a perfect example, blending Indian directness with Chinese practicality. It offered a path that resonated.
And modern science keeps finding more links.
It does. Those cave paintings in Dunhuang showing dark-skinned, bearded figures that look like the descriptions of Bodhidharma, archaeological finds along the trade routes confirming the movements of Indian monks, even DNA analysis of remains from early Chan sites showing South Asian genetic markers. It all paints a consistent picture.
Okay, and finally, let's touch on that martial arts link again. Shaolin Kung Fu. How does his Indian background shape that?
Well, the exercises he reportedly taught weren't just random calisthenics. They likely came directly from Indian yogic postures, asanas, and perhaps even martial conditioning practices.
Like the 18 Luan hands.
Exactly. Legend says those are basically modified Indian yoga poses adapted for the monks. And if you look at traditional Indian martial arts like Kalaripayattu from Kerala, you see strong parallels in things like breath control, stances, and the emphasis on mindful movement.
So the story is, he saw the monks were physically weak, maybe falling asleep during meditation.
That's the traditional narrative. He saw their physical condition was hindering their spiritual practice, so he introduced these methods to strengthen their bodies and minds. It was practical Indian wisdom applied to a specific problem.
And the breath control in Kung Fu.
Very likely has roots in Indian pranayama yogic breathing techniques. Bodhidharma would have mastered these and adapted them for his students in China. It's all interconnected.
Wow, what an absolutely incredible journey we've followed. This deep dive really hammers home his undeniable Indian connection, doesn't it? And his pivotal role is this amazing cultural bridge between India and China.
It really does. We've seen how core Indian dhyana practices, deep philosophical concepts like Buddha nature, and even the whole approach to gaining wisdom were profoundly transmitted and then transformed through him.
It's such a powerful reminder, too, of how Buddhism itself has this remarkable ability to adapt and flourish across totally different civilizations while still holding on to its essential wisdom.
It truly is adaptable.
Mhm.
So as you reflect on Bodhidharma's life and legacy, maybe consider how this ancient cross-cultural exchange, just perfectly epitomized by his journey, still resonates today.
Yeah.
It reminds us that ideas, wisdom, they don't really care about borders, do they? And that sometimes true understanding, real breakthroughs, come from these unexpected connections between seemingly disparate people, disparate traditions.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it, what other profound cross-cultural journeys might be shaping our world right now, maybe quietly, just beneath the surface.
Exactly. Something to think about.